Hello, everyone. I'd like to introduce what we are doing for our fourth American Classics test we'll do this semester, which is memorizing a piece of the Gettysburg Address. We've already done the first American Classics test, which was to learn the preamble to our Constitution. Our second American Classics test was learning the first verse to the Star-Spangled Banner. Our third American Classics test is learning to identify and spell the 50 states. And now we're on to our fourth one, which is learning about the first 40% or so of the Gettysburg Address. When we go to Gettysburg, we'll see the place where Abraham Lincoln actually delivered this very famous speech. Story is about the Gettysburg Address that President Lincoln went to Gettysburg about 4.5 months after the big, huge Battle of Gettysburg, which took place on July 1st through 3rd of 1863. The town of Gettysburg had about 2,400 residents at the time of the battle, and these two huge armies converged on Gettysburg, uh, pounded the fire out of each other for 3 days, and left a big mess. 3 days of heavy fighting was 51,000 casualties, which include the killed, the wounded, those who were captured and taken prisoner, and those who were just missing. Most of them were probably killed. They were either just never identified, or maybe, unfortunately, there wasn't enough of them left to identify. Nobody agrees on numbers. I go with about 8,000 killed, 21,000 wounded, many of whom, of course, will die later. Maybe 2,500, even 3,000 dead horses and mules. No telling how many amputated body parts. The people of Gettysburg have a complete and total mess on their hands once the battle is over and the two big armies have left. What do you do with all that? This is the gatehouse to the town cemetery called Evergreen Cemetery. And those, they do try to start burying people in the town cemetery, but that quickly is just impossible. And the U.S. government and several of the states put together some money and buy some land to begin burying Union dead, Northern dead, in a more formal sort of manner. Elizabeth Thorne is the brave soul who tried to dig graves with a shovel in rocky soil in the hot heat of summer. And at the time, she was 6 months pregnant with child number 4. This clearly is not going to work for her to be handling burying the dead. So a plan is put together for a national cemetery. That cemetery gatehouse we just saw and the statue of Mrs. Thorne are about right here. The plan for the cemetery is to have a central monument and then soldiers to be buried around that monument in a semicircle kind of shape based on what state they were from. They were buried by state. And some, of course, who are unknowns, we just didn't really know where what state they were from, so they're buried in sections for the unknowns. There's a picture of that central monument right in the middle, and the burials are then in a big semicircle around that. Soldiers are buried by state. You can see the name of a state and the number of bodies there. There are a couple of unknown sections. There are individual markers. One of those is to a man whose name is Sergeant Amos Humiston. He was originally one of the unknowns. He died with this picture in his hands, picture of 3 young children. Well, they had a guess at what unit he was with. They began publishing this picture in newspapers in the area where that regiment was recruited from. And eventually somebody recognized, yes, these are the Humiston children. And that's how Amos Humiston's body was finally identified. That picture and that touching story also became the basis for setting up a series of children's homes and orphans' homes to try to take care of widows and orphan children whose fathers or husbands were lost by the war. One of the graves is to a man named George Nixon, whose great-grandson became the 37th president of the United States. That's President Richard Nixon. President Lincoln traveled to Gettysburg in November of 1863, again, about 4.5 months after the battle, to help dedicate that cemetery. This picture is the Hanover Junction railroad station along our rail trail. Our rail trail here in York County, this way would go off towards York. This way branches off towards Hanover. It's possible that this tall man in the picture with a tall hat is President Lincoln. A lot of experts say it is. Some say, well, we're not so sure. This would be probably as they are coming back from Gettysburg and heading back towards Washington, D.C. This is the station today. And probably where President Lincoln was standing, if that's really him, would be right at this end of the building. The dedication ceremony was held on a gray, cloudy November day. The cemetery gatehouse is here. Between 12 and 15,000 people came to see a parade and hear the dedication ceremony, which went on for a couple of hours. The main speaker of the day was a man named Edward Everett. After he finished his almost 2-hour speech in a drizzly, chilly rain, President Lincoln gave his speech known as the Gettysburg Address. The stage is right here where you see this bump of people. The central monument that we saw in our earlier picture is located about where this flagpole is right now. So there you go. The tent has a special job. If you have been in American cultures class for very long, you know the special job is not all that special. Truth is, the man who was the main speaker of the day had the beginning of what eventually became bladder cancer. And so he was needing to use the bathroom a lot. The tent housed an outhouse. So he, during his 2-hour speech, had to take a few breaks, go in, use the outhouse, come back out, and continue speaking. That's the special job. So this is a photograph of the day. We don't actually have a picture of President Lincoln speaking. Edward Everett spoke for about 2 hours. And when the president got up to speak next, well, everybody expected he would outdo the president, right? He would go even longer and even better. Well, many people were very disappointed that President Lincoln's speech only lasted about 2 minutes. But Edward Everett, the main speaker, later told President Lincoln, "I wish I had said as much in 2 hours as you said in those 2 minutes." We consider President Lincoln's Gettysburg Address to be a classic, not only because it's short, but because it very succinctly defines what the Civil War is about and why, as horrible as the war is, we need to finish it. There's a drawn picture of President Lincoln speaking, standing on the stage. He has a text of the speech in his hand. 5 handwritten copies of that speech still exist. Here's what President Lincoln said, and we'll kind of explain what he's talking about here. He says, 407 years ago, now his score is 20, so that's why I have 4 scores, and 7. It means 87 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men, and we have women too, men being an 1860s kind of term to refer to everybody, are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing, funny picture, whether that nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives that that nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. In the cemetery at Gettysburg, there's a full text of the Gettysburg Address. We're only learning the first 40% or so, which is what you just heard. This monument in the National Cemetery at Gettysburg, we believe, is the only monument in the world to a speech. It has a bust of President Lincoln, and his face looks angry, but he's actually meant to represent the war-weary, exhausted president. On this side of the monument is the letter sent from the town fathers of Gettysburg to President Lincoln, asking him or inviting him to come to this dedication ceremony at Gettysburg. They really didn't think he would come. And when he did agree to come, well, then that caused quite a stir, of course. The Gettysburg Address is many, many places in our culture. The Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C. has an engraved copy. If you go up to the top of the steps where you see Mr. Lincoln, come over here to the left. On the wall of the on the Lincoln Memorial is a copy of the Gettysburg Address. That's the version we are memorizing. In case you look some up on the internet or whatever else, they might be a little bit different. But that's the one we're using is the one in the Lincoln Memorial in D.C. And so there it is, 7 years ago. There's versions of the Gettysburg Address in the White House. One copy is upstairs in a bedroom, not this bedroom, but on the other side of this one, the other side of the hallway, the back of the building, or the south front, because there is no back in the White House. That south front, there's a room known as the Lincoln Bedroom. One of the handwritten copies is in there. But also in the Oval Office, a phrase of the Gettysburg Address is in the carpet, is in the outline of the carpet here. This is the Oval Office where the president has his office and the president's desk. It really is an oval shape. There is an oval shaped carpet. And I think President Obama years is when this carpet was installed. And these are the people who work for the company that made the carpet. They have that phrase, government of the people, by the people, and for the people, which is part of that rug on the floor. So it's a pretty important thing to be in the Oval Office. Cemetery today, well, here's that big central monument. Tombs of graves of soldiers around it. This is one of the unknown sections where the grave markers are just very small and have a little number. The central monument has figures representing America at the time. We have peace and plenty. Most of the burials are done in rows with the head of the person near a memorial. Now, these are ones that say unknown on them. As you work your way around the cemetery, there are different states have different sections. The gravestones in the back are Adams County residents, World War I and II, and et cetera, veterans from other wars. Today, Jenny Wade is buried in the National Cemetery. We'll tell her story at Gettysburg. She is the only civilian killed in those 3 days of fighting. And Mrs. Elizabeth Thorne, who was trying to dig all those graves by herself at first, well, that, of course, didn't work out. There's the cemetery gatehouse today. There's an addition on it. And Mrs. Thorne and her husband and her 4 children lived in half of the gatehouse. Her parents lived in the other house. Most of that building still looks a lot like it did, except for this addition now where the man who is currently in charge of the cemetery lives. Pictures like this were big sellers during the Civil War. And so the Harvest of the Dead is showing us a picture of the aftermath of the Battle of Gettysburg and why such a cemetery is needed. You'll work on memorizing a piece of the Gettysburg Address, the piece you heard earlier in the video. You'll have some materials to help do this with, and this will be due in January after we come back from Christmas break.